Today our topic is the ocular blood supply, and in this video we are going to learn about the whole arterial system which is penetrating towards the eyeball. As you know that the major artery which is coming from the heart is called the internal carotid artery, and the sub branch of the internal carotid artery is ophthalmic artery. And ophthalmic artery is the artery which has a lot of branches, and some of them will penetrate in the eyeball. And today we are going to learn about these arterial system. And we will start our arterial pathway from the back of the eye, from the retina. As you know that there are two major pathways for the blood supply to the retina. The first one is called the central retinal artery, and the second one is called the posterior short ciliary arteries. And now we will learn about the whole pathway of this arterial system towards the retina. But before learning about the arterial system towards the retina, we must have some knowledge about the ocular barriers, the blood retinal barriers. And there are two different blood retinal barriers. The first one is called the outer blood retinal barrier, and the second one is called the internal blood retinal barrier. So now we will discuss about the blood retinal barriers. So first of all, we will discuss about the outer blood retinal barrier. You have to keep it in mind that outer blood retinal barrier is at the level of the retinal pigmented epithelium. You know that there are 10 different branches of the retina, and the very first pigmented layer of the retina is called the retinal pigmented epithelium, right? So suppose this is called the sclera. This is a part of eyeball. This is sclera. Beneath the sclera there is choroid, and beneath the choroid there is first layer of the retina. So this is called sclera, the first part. This is called choroid, and this is called the first layer of the eyeball, which is pigmentary layer, and this is called retinal pigmented epithelium, right? So the outer blood retinal barrier is at the level of the retinal pigmented epithelium, right? You know very well that the arterial system in the choroid is fenestrated, is leaky, right? The blood can freely move in the choroid because the choroid has choriocapillaries, and these choriocapillaries are fenestrated. These are leaky blood vessels, so the blood and the nutrition can move freely in the choroid. But you have to remember that our retina is semi-transparent, and the most sensitive part of the retina is the photoreceptor cells, the rods and the cones. These photoreceptor cells are most sensitive part of the retina, right? So these photoreceptor cells should be kept protected from the blood, right? So that's why, to protect the photoreceptor cells, there is a outer blood retinal barrier in the retinal pigmented epithelium, because the second layer of the retina is the photoreceptors layer, the layer of the rods and the cones, and we have to protect the photoreceptor cells and the further neuronal layer of the retina from the blood. So for that we have to put a barrier at the level of retinal pigmented epithelium. So the endothelial cells of the, you can say, retinal pigmented epithelium has tight junctions. They are strictly attached with each other. They are adherent to each other. They are strictly attached to each other. So the cells of the retinal pigmented epithelium, suppose these are endothelial cells, right? So these cells, which are endothelial cells of the retinal pigmented epithelium, these cells are firmly attached with each other, so they would not allow the blood and any nutrition to pass through the retinal pigmented epithelium, so it can move towards the photoreceptor cells. You can see this is photoreceptor cells. Yes, you can see these cells in the green marker are rods and cones, the photoreceptor cells, and these photoreceptor cells should be protected from the blood. right? Blood should not go in the photoreceptor cells and further in the neuronal layer, the remaining layers of the retina. So for that protection, there are endothelial cells in the retinal pigmented epithelium which will protect the photoreceptor cells. So these barrier in the retinal pigmented epithelium, the tight junction between the endothelial cells of the retinal pigmented epithelium, this is called outer blood retinal barrier, right? And now we will discuss about the inner blood retinal barrier. So before learning about the inner blood retinal barrier, we have to discuss about the passage of the central retinal artery, right? As you know that we have discussed that the major branch is internal carotid artery. The major artery is the internal carotid artery, which is coming from the heart, and the sub branch of that internal carotid artery is ophthalmic artery. So here we have heart. This is not a physiological heart, right? Right. So the internal carotid artery, the first artery which is coming from the the heart is internal carotid artery, and the sub branch of the internal carotid artery is which is concerned with the eye, with the eyeball, is ophthalmic artery. And this ophthalmic artery has many sub branches. One of them, and the major sub branch of the ophthalmic artery, is called the central retinal artery. You know that we have discussed about the whole retina, the whole anatomy and physiology of the retina in previous video. The link is in the description, you can watch it if you want. So there are 10 different layers of the retina, right? From retinal pigmented epithelium and so on, right? So the blood supply of the retina is consist of two pathways, and the first pathway is called this through the central retinal artery. So if we have, this is heart, and this is the major branch which is called the internal carotid artery, and it has sub branch which is called the ophthalmic artery. And now ophthalmic artery has a sub branch. Ophthalmic artery has many branches. Now in this video we will discuss about the one or somehow 3 to 4 branches, and one of them is called the ophthalmic artery. And ophthalmic artery has many branches. One of them is called the central retinal artery. So the central retinal artery will pierce in the optic nerve, right? So from the heart, internal carotid artery's sub branch is called the ophthalmic artery. Ophthalmic artery's sub branch is called the central retinal artery. And the central retinal artery, how it pierces the eyeball, now we will discuss about it. So the central retinal artery will pierce in the optic nerve, at the level of the optic nerve. So you know that there are 3 different meninges of the optic nerve, right? The most anterior, or the outer you can say, meninges is called the dura mater, and the second one is called arachnoid mater, and the third one is pia mater, right? This is not the topic actually. So the central retinal artery will pierce in the dura mater, the dural sheath of the optic nerve, right? And it will pierce the dura mater, and then it will move towards a specific structure which is called lamina cribrosa. You can see over here, this is lamina cribrosa. You can see the perforations, you can see these holes, and you can see this lamina cribrosa, this layer is something depressed, right? So these perforations is called the lamina cribrosa. So from these perforations, this is the passage actually, these perforations are the passage of many blood vessels and the nerves. So central retinal artery is one of the artery which passes through the lamina cribrosa, from these perforations of the lamina cribrosa. So the central retinal artery will pass through these perforations, and this is actually after the lamina cribrosa, there is the major part of the retina which is called the optic disc. Here At this level it is optic disc, right? So from the optic disc, the central retinal artery will get admission in the retinal layers. So the central retinal artery will penetrate in the inner 5 layers of the eyeball. Sorry, the inner 5 layers of the retina. Right? There are 10 layers of the retina. So the central retinal artery will penetrate through the optic. Sorry, the optic nerve and the dural sheath of the optic nerve, and will pass through the lamina cribrosa, and after that, after lamina cribrosa, it will pass through the optic disc, and after passing through the optic disc, it will move towards the retina, and it will give nourishment, give blood supply to the inner 5 layers of the retina, right? So if I can see you here, there are different branches of the central retinal artery when it passes through the retina. Yes, this is back of the eye. You can see from here, this is back of the eye, and you know that there is, if this is the nose, this is the second eye, this is called towards the nose, this is optic disc, and from optic disc at the lateral side, here it is macula or the fovea. The fovea is the point where the sharpest, which we have the sharpest visual acuity, where we gain sharpest visual acuity, right? Because there is millions of cones at the level of the macula or the fovea, so that's why the visual acuity is sharpest at the level of macula or fovea. So this is called fovea, and this is called the optic disc, and this is your beautiful nose, and this is the fellow eye. So the central retinal artery will pass through, this is central retinal artery, which is coming from actually from the lamina cribrosa, and after that, after passing through the lamina cribrosa and optic disc, this central retinal artery will convert into inferior branch and superior branch, right? And now the central retinal artery has two different branches. One is superior branch and second is inferior branch, and then these superior branch will convert into two further branches, and that is superior temporal, because it is going towards temporal side. So this is called superior temporal branch, and this is called the superior nasal branch, because it moving towards the nose, right? And this is called the inferior nasal, and this is called the inferior temporal or lateral branch of the central retinal artery. So the central retinal artery will give nourishment to all quadrant of the retina in the inner 5 layers, right? So it has these branches, these two branches, which are superior nasal and superior temporal, has further branches, right? So, and keep it in mind that these branches of the central retinal arteries are end branches. They are not get unite to each other, right? If this is the inferior temporal, it will only nourish, it will only give blood supply to this quadrant. This branch will not get anastomose or get unite with this branch, right? They are separate branches, so that's why these are called the end branches, right? So that was all about the central retinal artery. And now at this point we will discuss about the inner blood retinal barrier. You have to keep it in mind that the inner blood retinal barrier is not at some layers, right? The inner blood retinal barrier is at the capillaries level. You know that these are branches of the retina, right? These are branches of the retina, different branches. So at the capillaries level of the retina, there is, as you know, you have to remember that we have discussed in the choroid that the choriocapillaries of the choroid are leaky, the fenestrated blood vessels. The blood can move freely, you remember, in the choroid. But in the retina, you have to keep it in mind that in the retina, there is no any fenestrated blood vessels. There is no any fenestrated capillaries, right? The blood is strictly consist in the blood vessels. Blood is not allowed to come out in the retinal tissues, right? For blood, retina is a red zone. So blood is not allowed to move freely in the retina. The blood should be in the blood vessels. So at the capillaries level of the you can say the retina, there are strictly bounded endothelial cells in the capillaries. So that's why due to these capillaries, the blood is not allowed to come out of these blood vessels, to come out of these capillaries, right? Suppose this is the capillaries. This is capillary of the retina, and there are specialized cells in the capillaries of the retina which are called the pericytes, right? These cells in the blue marker. These cells are called the pericytes, Pericytes, the pericytes. These are specialized cells. They make the endothelial cells of the capillaries of the retina will bound together. They will get bounded together. They will strictly attach to each other. So these pericyte cells will not allow the blood to come out of these capillaries, right? Otherwise it will cause the hemorrhage, the retinal hemorrhage, right? So these are the pericyte cells which actually protect the retina, the retinal tissues from the blood, from the hemorrhage, right? So these, at the capillaries level of the retina, these endothelial cells and the pericytes in the capillaries level of the retina, they will protect the retinal tissues from the blood. So these barrier is called the inner blood retinal barrier. So now we will discuss about the other system, arterial system of the eyeball. And now we will discuss about the another pathway for the rest of the layers of the retina, the outer 5 layers of the retina, right? Which is super sensitive for the light, right? And now we have discussed about, as you can see here, this is heart. The major artery which is coming from the heart is internal carotid artery, and then sub branch is ophthalmic artery, and then the sub branch was central retinal artery. It pierces the dura mater, then passes through the lamina cribrosa, and then passes through the optic disc, and then give nourishment to the 5 layers of the retina, which was inner 5 layers. And now we will discuss about the rest of the arterial system for the rest of the retinal layers, right? And there is another sub branch of the ophthalmic artery. You can see here, this is ophthalmic artery, this is ophthalmic artery, and the sub branch of the ophthalmic artery is called the short posterior ciliary artery. The first one was the central retinal artery, and the second one is called, which is a sub branch of the ophthalmic artery actually, right? And the name of this artery is called the short posterior ciliary artery. And now we will discuss about the route, the pathway of this short posterior ciliary artery. Simply, it will pierce the sclera. The central, you have to make a difference over here, that the central retinal artery was piercing through the dura mater of the optic nerve, right? But the short posterior ciliary artery will pierce the sclera directly, right? And it will pierce the sclera, and it will travel through, sorry, if you go anatomically, this should pierce over here near the optic nerve, not in the optic nerve, but near the optic nerve here, right? At this point, near the optic nerve, right? So this posterior short ciliary artery will pierce near the optic nerve at the level of sclera. It will actually pierce the sclera, and it will pierce and it will travel through a specific structure which is called suprachoroidal lamina, or you can say the suprachoroidal space. And what is suprachoroidal space? What is suprachoroidal lamina? You can see, you have to learn about the basic structure. We have to repeat the basic structure of the eyeball. As you can see here, this black marker, which is actually the whitish of the eye, is called the sclera. Beneath the sclera, this red marker is called the choroid, right? And underneath the choroid, there is two major layers of the retina. The first one, the layer in the you can say the blue marker, is called the retinal pigmented epithelium, right? And beneath the retinal pigmented epithelium, there is a layer which is in the green marker, is called the neuronal layer of the retina, right? So coming to the lecture, short posterior ciliary artery will pierce in the sclera, and then after piercing through the sclera, it will passes through a space which is called the suprachoroidal space, through the suprachoroidal lamina. And what is suprachoroidal lamina? Actually, the suprachoroidal lamina is the layer between the sclera and the choroid itself, right? So the space between the choroid and the sclera itself, the layers between the sclera and the choroid is called the suprachoroidal space, this space, right? So the short posterior ciliary artery will pierce in the sclera and will travel through the suprachoroidal lamina, right? And it will also supply the the outer 5 layers of the retina, right? This short posterior ciliary artery will also supply the outer 5 branches of the retina. The central retinal artery will supply the inner 5 layers of the retina, right? And this short posterior ciliary artery will supply the outer 5 layers of the retina, including the layers of the rods and the cones, the photoreceptor layer, which is the most sensitive, right? And you have to remember that the blood vessels in the retinal tissues are not leaky, are not fenestrated, right? We have discussed about the barriers. So now again, short posterior ciliary artery will pierce in the sclera and then travel through the suprachoroidal lamina and will supply the rest of the 5 layers, which are outer 5 layers of the retina, right? And also this short posterior ciliary artery will travel through the suprachoroidal lamina in it will give supply to the ciliary body as well, which is the intermediate uvea, right? So this short posterior ciliary artery will supply outer 5 layers of the retina and also to the ciliary body, the intermediate uvea. And if I go more specifically, it will supply this you can say the ciliary processes. If you want to know about the ciliary processes, you can watch the video on the aqueous humor production, circulation and drainage, right? So that was all about the another pathway for the arterial system or the blood supply to the retina. So we have discussed about the central retinal artery, we have discussed about the short posterior ciliary artery, and now we will discuss about the further branches of the ophthalmic artery, which is actually coming from the internal carotid artery, and internal carotid artery is actually coming from the heart, right? So now we will discuss about the further branches of the ophthalmic artery. So after central retinal artery and short posterior ciliary artery which travels in the retina, now we will discuss about the long posterior ciliary artery. The new branch which is coming from the ophthalmic artery is called the long posterior ciliary artery, right? So again, this is heart, which we should not break. This is called the heart, and the other which is as this is internal carotid artery, right? And again it is called the ophthalmic artery. Now one more branch of the ophthalmic artery is called the long posterior ciliary artery, right? So another branch from the ophthalmic artery is called the long posterior ciliary artery, and now we will learn about this artery which is called the long posterior ciliary artery, right? You have to remember that this long posterior ciliary arteries are 2 in number in each eye, right? If this is the eyeball, the long posterior ciliary artery will go from the right of this eye and from left of this eye, like in this fashion, right? So the long posterior ciliary arteries are 2 in number. So this long posterior ciliary artery will pierce in the sclera from here and also from here, right? So two long posterior ciliary artery which are actually the sub branches of the ophthalmic artery will pierce in the sclera from right and left. If this is the eyeball, you can say this is the eyeball. The one long posterior ciliary artery will pierce in this fashion and one in this fashion, from right and from left, right? And these long posterior ciliary arteries will pierce in the sclera, and then after piercing the sclera it will touch the next structure which is called the posterior uvea, which is actually called the choroid, right? And it will supply also the choroidal layers, right? So the first action of this long posterior ciliary artery is the nourishment of the choroid, right? So why it is called, it is a question that why this artery is called long artery, why this is called the posterior artery. There is a logic behind that, there is a reason behind that, that why it is called the long posterior ciliary artery, that why it is called the posterior ciliary artery, right? The reason is because it piercing the sclera and then it travel more and more, right? So that's why it is called long. It will pierce the sclera, travel through the suprachoroidal lamina, will supply to the choroid, and then after traveling, it will also supply the ciliary body as well. The ciliary body, right? And also after traveling, it will also supply the iris, this colorful structure which we can see with the eyes, the anterior colorful structure of the eye, iris. So that's why these long posterior ciliary arteries are two in number, and it will pierce the eyeball, the one eye, from right and from left, and it will give nourishment to the choroid, to the ciliary body, and to the iris. So the whole uveal tract is actually partially nourishing by the long posterior ciliary arteries as well. And now we will discuss about the muscular branches of the ophthalmic artery, right? So as you can see here, this is our ophthalmic artery again, and there are muscular branches. There are muscular branches of the ophthalmic artery as well. As you know that there are different recti muscles in the eyeball. You know that there are 4 different recti muscles in the eyeball. The first one is called the superior rectus, second one is called the inferior rectus, the lateral rectus, and the medial rectus, right? There are 4 different recti muscles in the eyeball. So the supply, the arterial supply toward these muscles are actually coming from the ophthalmic artery, from the sub branches of the ophthalmic artery, which are muscular branches. So these muscular branches are pairs in the muscles, and there are 7 branches, right? 2 branches for the superior rectus, 2 branches for the inferior rectus, 2 branches for the medial rectus, and 1 for the lateral rectus. 2 branches for each muscles and 1 for lateral rectus. So 2 for superior, 2 for inferior, 2 for medial, and 1 for lateral, right? So there are 7 branches, and they will supply the recti muscles. We have done it, right? And after piercing through the muscles, they give their sub branches, and these branches are called the anterior ciliary arteries. The anterior ciliary arteries, right? So there are 7 different anterior ciliary arteries, and they will supply to the sclera, the outer toughest membrane, the white of the eye. You can see in my eye, the whitish of the eye. They anterior ciliary arteries, which are actually coming from the muscular branches of the recti muscles, they will supply the sclera, and yes, the conjunctiva as well. Sclera plus conjunctiva. So muscular branches will nourish the recti muscles, and from the recti muscles they will give their sub branches, which are called the anterior ciliary arteries, and there are 7 different anterior ciliary arteries which will give supply to the sclera and the conjunctiva as well. And now we will discuss about the major arterial ring and the lesser arterial ring in the iris. As you know that we have discussed about the long posterior ciliary artery, long posterior ciliary artery, right? There are 2 in number. The long posterior ciliary arteries are 2 in each eye, and we also have discussed about the anterior ciliary arteries, that arteries which are supplying to sclera and conjunctiva, right? Anterior ciliary arteries. And these anterior ciliary arteries will also nourish some of the iris, some parts of the iris as well. So both of them, the long posterior ciliary arteries and the anterior ciliary arteries, will make major arterial ring and lesser arterial ring. Suppose, no, I should go for, there is red on the board, so I should go for something different. So this is our eyeball, right? You can say this is our iris, and the central aperture is called the pupil, right? And this is the ciliary body. This is frontal view of the eyeball, right? And the two long posterior ciliary arteries will pierce from the left of the eyeball and from right of the eyeball. Two long posterior ciliary arteries, right? And there are 7 different anterior ciliary arteries we have discussed, right? So they will also pierce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So these are long posterior ciliary arteries, which are 2 in number, and rest of them, the 7, are anterior ciliary arteries. So all of these arteries will make a ring at the base of the iris, at the root of the iris here, right? And this ring is called the major arterial ring, the major ring of the arteries at the base of the iris, right? So now this ring will give their sub branches towards the pupillary margin, and these branches will anastomose here, they will get united over here at the pupillary margin, and they will make an other ring of arteries, and this is called smaller ring or lesser ring of arteries. So finally, we have discussed every structure of the eyeball, right? And the drainage is through the varicose veins, right? There are 4 different channels of the varicose veins through which the all deoxygenated blood from the different structures of the eyeball will travel towards the heart for the pumping, for addition of the oxygen. I hope all is clear regarding this topic. And now if you want to learn about the anatomy and physiology of the retina, you can watch these videos. And if you want to learn about the anatomy and physiology of the iris, you can watch these videos. And if you want to learn about the aqueous humor production, drainage and circulation, you can watch these videos. And if you want to learn about the subjective refraction, you can watch this playlist.